Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Phil Gaines. I'm with Clemson University, and welcome to the National Association of State Park Directors webinar, a webinar series in partnership with Clemson University. And we're real excited to have two really special guests with us today. And we're also really excited to have over 200 participants involved in this webinar. So a very exciting day, but we have a really timely topic that we want to talk about. So I want to go over a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. Over 200 participants are in the webinar today. So if you haven't already, if you will place yourself on mute, that'll just keep us from hearing dogs barking in the background and all the other kind of noises that's going on in the world today. And we'll start with our presentation, and at the conclusion of our presentation, we'll have time for some discussion and some questions. We'll monitor chat as much as possible, and we'll try to, if you have a question or a discussion, we'll try very strategically for you just to come on in and make your point. Be very mindful of other folks and how difficult this will be. And we'll do our best to do a little bit better than they did in the debates last night without walking on top of each other. So with that being said, at the conclusion of the presentation, we'll have some discussion and questions, like I said, and then we'll go over our next webinar that will be November 12th. And we'll talk a little bit about that and what that topic will be. But right now, I think we're ready to get started with this webinar. And today's session is a discussion about race in America's state parks. So what we'd like to do is get started on this. And I know we're having a little bit of technical difficulty on one end. So I'll introduce our speakers today. First up will be Dr. Myron Floyd. Dr. Floyd is the Dean of the College of Natural Resources at North Carolina State University, has more than 35 years experience in the park and recreation field. He's the co-author of Race, Ethnicity, and Leisure. Dr. Floyd is a national leader in our field on park and recreation, not just in the topic we're talking about today, but really a national leader in parks and recreation and public land management. And it's a true honor to have Dean Floyd with us today. Some of you may recognize Dr. Floyd as part of North Carolina State University faculty, and before he was the dean, he was a department chair and was actively involved in the State Park Leadership School and has been with us a couple of times at Ogilvy. So Dean Floyd, thank you for being with us. We're looking forward to your presentation today. Along with Dean Floyd is Dr. Harrison Pinckney. Dr. Pinckney is an assistant professor in the Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Management program here at Clemson University. Dr. Pinckney is nationally recognized for his research and work with African-American youth and how systems, institutions, and programs influence the socialization of these youth. Dr. Pinckney as well is nationally known leader in this field. And it is also an honor to have my friend and colleague, Dr. Pinckney, with us today. And we're really excited to do something that I think we want to do very differently. We want to have a conversation about race, and we think this is the perfect time to do that. And judging by the number of participants that we have today, I think America's state parks are ready to have that discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dean Floyd and Dr. Pinckney, and they will share their screen, and we'll do a PowerPoint presentation. And at the conclusion of their presentation, we'll have opportunity for discussion and questions. Gentlemen.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and want to just thank all of you who've joined us this afternoon, 200 plus of you. That sounds like a very good number. So we really appreciate you spending time with us this afternoon on this topic. Also should thank Lewis Ledford for first bringing this topic up with me and just asking if I wanted to be a part of it, and Phil for following up. And so I just owe them a little bit of thanks for letting us spend a few minutes with you to talk about this important topic. And engaging in a conversation about it, even though we will do a presentation, we hope that it will open up some dialogue and to think, as Phil said, how we perhaps can think differently about how we manage parks, provide visitor services and programs. But the goal today is very straightforward. As far as what we want to do, we want to first provide some context on how we got to this afternoon, how we got to this actual webinar, some historical context, but also some contemporary context. I'll take a few minutes to give some brief visitation statistics from federal recreation areas. I don't have any data on state park use, but I just want to make a couple of points based on that. And most of the time, we will reflect on that context and that data to offer some observations or some points for us to consider, or some questions for us to think about. I want to emphasize that we're not going to give you recommendations, even though some of them may sound like recommendations. But we know that every park, most parks are different. You have different situations and different challenges, but there is some commonality. But we do want those to be a starting point. And so that's how we will offer those observations. And before Harrison takes over here, I do want to also say that those starting points and questions are based on professional experience, personal experience, and some ongoing research on the topic. So there is some basis for what we are proposing this afternoon. So with that, I'll let Harrison answer the question of, how do we get here? You muted?
Yes, thank you. All right, so thank you also for the opportunity to be here. Myron, thank you for the introduction. So two things. One, I lost my voice yesterday, which Myron laughs every time he hears that because I talk a lot. And secondly, I'm having some major internet challenges, so I am actually on my phone. So we'll see how this works out. So Shauna's going to sort of work with us and get us to the next slide. And I think one of the critical things for us to acknowledge is we're not just here at random, and that we're at a very unique moment and space in the history of this country, where first we're in the middle of a pandemic, and so that has led to a lot of people like myself who's sitting at home, not really engaging in social institutions the way that we normally would, not being able to go to church or visit, friends and things of that nature. And at the same time, something that some of us are aware of is this loss of life and this violence, physical harm that is occurring specifically against people of color in this country. And what is unique about it is that because we're home as a result of COVID, our attention is a little bit more heightened, and we have a greater sense of awareness about some of these issues that are currently occurring, that if we were not in the middle of a pandemic, if we were still, when we first got on the call, there was a discussion about football. If we were still engaged in college football the way that we normally would be, and still visiting the movies, and still traveling and engaging in life, these issues might still be occurring, but we may not necessarily have as great a sense or keen a sense of awareness. And so we want to acknowledge that those two phenomena have sort of contributed to where we are at this moment in history. So Shauna, if you'll take us to the next slide. What we want to do is, Myron is going to start us by having this conversation about, sort of a historic overview of what has been occurring in our country as it relates to state parks and federal parks. And then I'm going to come back and sort of overlay that with what has been going on simultaneously in other aspects of life. And Myron, you're muted.
Thank you, Harris. One thing to think about in this conversation, just to set some brief context for us, is to think about history. I mean, really, I'll just call it environmental and conservation history. And there's some big milestones that we're going to put up, and we're not going to go into great detail, but I just think it's interesting to draw some parallels. When we think about, and I'll go back to my school a little bit, I was always taught that our first state park was the Yosemite Grant in 1864. There are other references to Niagara, Adirondacks, and other areas being the first protected state areas. But if we can just put that one up, 1864. And then there's another date. You can go ahead and pop them all up. 1872 is the date that we have for the Yellowstone Park Act, creating the first federal national park in the world. 1916, the beginning of the National Park Service. And I might be corrected on this. I should know this. This is also the birth of the North Carolina State Park System. We mentioned at the beginning the Great American Outdoors Act. Its forerunner, the Land Awarded Conservation Act. I want to say that was 1965, but in 64 we also had the Wilderness Act. So we had some major conservation legislation across time. And it's interesting to pair those events with what was also happening in society at large. So those would be the pink circles that Harrison will address.
Right, so when we look at 1864, as Myron mentioned, and the first park sort of being established, the very next year is when we see the passing and ratification of the 13th Amendment, where African Americans are being freed from slavery. And when we move forward to 1898, this is where we see Plessy versus Ferguson. And for those of us that are not familiar with that particular case, that was a case that was brought before the Supreme Court that upheld the concept of separate but equal. So it was constitutionally acceptable for public spaces, including our parks, to remain segregated as long as equal services were being provided. And so we move forward to 1954. And at this point, we come across Brown versus the Board of Education. And this is sort of a rebuke of the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, where now this concept of separate but equal is now being challenged. And the Supreme Court is now saying that, no, it is perfectly acceptable and constitutional for us to provide the same facility for our young people to be able to engage in education. And so separate but equal, this is where we start to see the beginning of the end at that point. And then, of course, 1964, and Myron just referenced the Wilderness Act. 1964 is also the same year that we see the passing of the Civil Rights Movement. And so, Sean, if you go ahead and click, what we label this era as the Park Service is starting to be established both at the state and federal level. What we see is this entire population of people coming out of slavery, but not having access to some of these same facilities in these same areas, protected areas, as a result of their race. And so we start here because we think it's important to highlight the idea that as the concept of parks is being taking shape, as these conversations are being had about who should be, about who should be allowed into the parks, what is the purpose and role of the parks, what does the conservation conversation look like, what does the preservation conversation look like? there's an entire swath of people that is being excluded from all of those conversations, not just excluded from access to those facilities, but not even being included in the conversation of what role or purpose should these conversations include. And so now if you click forward, after that, from 1964 to 1995, it is illegal for these spaces to be segregated. However, what we would suggest to you all is that despite that being the case, there was still this neglect. Some of it may have been deliberate, some of it may have been unconscious, but there's been this neglect where we would argue that many of our agencies didn't take a proactive approach to sort of identifying how do we engage this population. Okay, and so 1995, and I'll let Myron talk a little bit here about what happened in 95 that sort of began to awaken us as a discipline and as a field to why we needed to no longer take the neglective approach.
Well, just a couple of quick things. One, at the federal level, we began to start looking at demographic projections, which I will hit on a little bit later, just looking at the future of the country and what the demographic profile would be many years into the future, and that's typically mid-century. And the other thing that began to get attention is the emphasis on that neglect, and particularly one particular executive order in 1998, the environmental justice executive order passed by President Clinton, or at least issued by President Clinton, which focused on differential benefits of natural resources and the environment, not just in terms of which communities are being harmed by environmental hazards and pollution and things like that, but which communities are disproportionately not being benefited by things like park and green spaces and access to clean air and those kinds of things. So there is some, beyond the civil rights legislation of the mid-60s, we begin to see these presidential executive orders focused on race and equal opportunity for all kinds of natural resources, including outdoor recreation. So you can click on the next one.
And so here, what we believe has occurred is since 1995, approximately 25 years, that a range of agencies, as Myron has mentioned, is now asking this question, how do we prepare for the year 2040, the year 2050, as our, and of course we're in another census year, but the suggestion is that by that time, the white majority will become the minority, and these other racial minority groups will outnumber, for the first time in this country's history, will outnumber, or modern history, I should say, will outnumber the white majority. And recognizing it has very drastic implications for almost every aspect of life, including our state parks, our federal lands, and our local community recreation agencies. All right, so let's move forward. All right, and so I suggested at the beginning that we've been seeing this disproportionate treatment of African Americans and other people of color in our parks. And so I just want to give you all a few examples just from this year alone. So the first one, if you'll click, our first example is Christian Cooper, who I think many of us probably caught wind of this story. This is the Black ornithologist or bird watcher that just a few months ago was in Central Park in New York City and was out, and this is the attire he wore. He was out watching, just engaging in some bird watching. There was a white woman that was in the park who had her dog off the leash. And so what he did was he asked her to, would you mind putting your dog on the leash? Sorry,
There you
I've
go.
been talking. So Christian Cooper here, and what we have is out in Central Park. He's watching birds. He's a bird watcher, professional ornithologist, and he writes on this. And so in this process, he sees a white woman who is has her dog off the leash. And so he asks her, per park policy, would you mind putting your dog on a leash? And her response was to call 911. And he pulled out his cell phone. He recorded all of this in the moment. And here's a quote in his own words that or in her words, that you see in the video footage. This isn't a secondhand report. This isn't a interpretation of the event, but you see her as he's asking her to put her dog on a leash. She says, I'm taking a picture and I'm calling the cops. I'm going to tell them that an African-American man is threatening my life. And you see him standing calmly asking her to put the dog on the leash. And of course, a lot of things ensue from here. And this isn't the only situation that we've had recently. If you'll continue to advance us, Shauna.
I think last year, maybe it was 2018, I had a chance to meet Rahawa Haley. She wrote an article in Outside Magazine about her through hike on the Appalachian Trail. And it was interesting because on the trail, near the, I want to say it was near the Georgia border, Georgia, North Carolina border, she passed a man who basically stopped her and, had a conversation with her and asked her where she was from. And she told him Miami. And he was a white man, and he continued to ask her, well, where are you really from? And this is, if you want to read it, it's an Outside Magazine. And she said, well, my roots are Eritrean, which is East Africa. And this is a quote from her about him. He said, oh, you're African, not black. Blacks don't hike. And so in that conversation, it wasn't necessarily the same as Christian Cooper's interaction, or some others we're going to share. But there is this interaction which contests or raises a question about who belongs here, who belongs in the out of doors. What does an outdoors person look like? And I think that is something that we'll come back and reflect on that at the end as well. And another one, Dudley Edmondson, he's an environmental filmmaker and photographer, another professional from Minnesota. This was something I read about, somewhat funny, but it could have been serious. In his own neighborhood, he was taking pictures of wildflowers, and a woman accused him of casing houses, staking out houses as if he was planning to steal. But the thing was, he was just taking pictures of wildflowers. And the person's response was, you don't look like any photographers I've ever seen. So again, this idea of who gets to define what an outdoors person looks like, and what a nature enthusiast looks like.
And lastly, we have Ahmaud Arbery. And as you can see with the other three, that there are quotes available. There is no quote for the Ahmaud Arbery story, because sadly, this was a young man in his early 20s that was out jogging back in February down in Brunswick, Georgia. And similar to what was suggested with Dudley Edmondson, was this idea that this was a guy that was in the wrong place. And it wasn't that he was actually in the wrong place, but this perception of, you don't belong in this part of town, you don't belong in this neighborhood. And so it's the abbreviated version of the story is that two cars began to follow him because they considered him suspicious as a jogger. And the father-son duo pulled out guns and attempted to conduct a citizen arrest. And again, because he's not here, we don't know what he thought was occurring. So when they tried to cut him off in their car, he just ran around the car because he didn't know what was going on. All of this is caught on video from a second vehicle that was also surveilling this young man. And the son from this father-son duo pulled out a shotgun and ultimately shot Ahmaud Arbery in his stomach, and he died there on the scene. And so in a matter of 4 minutes, and I want us to think about this, in a matter of 4 minutes, less than 4 minutes, he went from being a recreationist to a suspect to ultimately a murder victim. And this is not an uncommon occurrence. And that is ultimately one of the things that we want us to think about, that this is something, not so much that it always ends in murder, but this idea of a recreationist, because of their skin tone, their race, becoming a suspect for other behavior when they are engaged in behaviors that everyone else in the same space is engaged in, but their very presence makes them a suspect. And so now Myron is going to share some data about what's sort of going on in our parks.
Yeah, so it's going to change, change gears just a bit, and just talk about the importance of the outdoors. And I do want to share a little bit of data on that, and then look at some visitation data. But one thing I'll just say about the previous slide, that we had 3 people who were active outdoors people. I mean, they're active outdoors, and they own the AT, observing wildlife, and that kind of thing. But just wanted to just point to this study real quick. It's a national study authored by the late Steve Kellert, world famous Steve Kellert, and DJ Case, who some of you might know, might have used his work. But in this report published in 2017, these 2 statistics stand out to me. And there's one survey question that I want to just use. And as you can read it here, it says, how important is getting outdoors into nature helping, how important is that for your health, for helping your physical health? And I just want to point out that just the high percentages for Black respondents and for Latino respondents. Well over 2/3 of Black respondents reported highly important, well over 2/3, 68%. And 83% of Latino respondents reported the same, highly important. And I just want to put that in context. Just go to the next slide. When we look at all the major racial categories from that report, just trying to detailing that out a little bit. If you look over at the highly important bars, there's not much difference between what's here, white, Hispanic, Black, Asian, in terms of how important nature is for people's health. But there is a gap or a disparity between, it seems, between the use of parks and travel to parks. Next slide, please. So these are data from the National Park Service, from their comprehensive survey of the American public. This is a household survey. This is not on-site, a household survey conducted back in around 2008, slightly before then, but reported in 2008 and 2009. And their measure of visitation was when they asked the question, did you use a park in the last 2 years, and can you name it? That was their measure. But if you look at this, at my far left, 53% of whites said yes, they had visited a park in the last two years. Among Hispanic Americans, is labeled here, just under a third, 32%. And Black African American was at 28%, and you can see the rest, 53% for Asian American and 37% for Native American, American Indians. But the point is that we see this, I'm going to call a gap between this interest in valuing on nature, but looking at national park visits, there are these disparities in visitation. Next slide, please. And if we also look at use of national forest recreation areas, and this is from their data summarized from 2012 to 2016. And these are on-site surveys. So this is not household. This is going on-site, surveying people at a recreation area. And the majority of that pie is I don't know what to call this color, Harrison, but I think it's orange. Let's call it orange for the day. But 97% of it is non-Hispanic white. And as you can see there, very small slithers for other ethnic groups. But again, the point is the majority of use of federal national forest recreation areas is in that non-Hispanic white category. Next slide, please. And I highlight that one because it might be most similar to what many of you are seeing in that national forest visits. If you look at this bar chart, their visits by travel distance, just under 35% for most national forest visits, people travel less than 25 miles. So that's, I would say, for some folks, that's fairly accessible. And wilderness visits are about the same. And under 50 miles, you know, there's 20, that's substantial for wilderness visits, and which is more than national forest visits. But again, I put this out there because it might mimic what we might see in state parks more than what we see for the national parks. Next slide. So Harrison mentioned that you know, demographic projections show that we will see a restructuring of the population by mid-century, but I want to show this in a different way. In this pie chart, it shows us the US population growth between 2000 and 2050. This just tells us that between 2000 and 2050, that we'll add about 157 million people to the population. So this is not a growth of what the representation that will be. This just tells us how many people we're going to add to the population and what percentages of those people come from different racial and ethnic groups. So of that 157 million, 62% will be Hispanic, and 22% will be Asian and other ethnic groups, and 11% will be Black, 5% non-Hispanic white. So that's not going to be the representation. That just tells us which group is going to account more for that population growth. So to put this in more context, I want to just refer to a quote by Jonathan Jarvis, the former director of the National Park Service. And I'm just going to read it. But he says, quote, "When I look at our current base of support, they are reflective of only one segment of society, which is older, predominantly white, and middle and upper income class. That group is soon to be a minority in our nation. If I were a business and that were my clientele, I wouldn't be in business for much longer," end of quote. My point is that if we're looking toward 2050, as Harrison suggested, then we're looking at our future stewards, our future customers, our future visitors, our supporters, then it would behoove us to pay attention to where this growth is occurring in the population to see how we can close that gap, what I'm calling a gap between interest and participation. Participation, state parks, federal parks, and other types of resource-based recreation.
So the question that we want to pose to you is, of course, there's this big question that we're going to help answer, but I want us to think about a few smaller questions that could contribute to this conversation. First is, how do we normalize Black bodies and Black faces in the great outdoors? In other words, how do we get to a point where Ahmaud Arbery or Christian Cooper can go out and visit one of our state parks or one of our federal lands, and it's not an anomaly. It's not something that's odd or stands out and catches us off guard. How do we make nature more accessible? This is a question that we've been attempting to answer for some time now. I want you to think about your agencies that you represent. Are you truly prepared for 2040, 2050, those the next 20 to 30 years? Or do you see steps being put in place where by the time we get to the realization that we have these large pockets of racial minority groups, interested in visiting our spaces, that we're ready to serve them? And if not, if we're not there, then the question is, what will it take for us to get there? And so over the next few slides, and you can start advancing us, Shauna, we're going to attempt to help resolve this question of how do we close the gap. So Myron's going to give some attention directly to what our agencies can be doing to assist in this effort. And then I'm going to shift our attention to understand how do we close the gap specifically for our African-American communities. Unmute Myron.
I've only been doing this for like, what, 4 months every day, 3 hours a day, three, 4, 6 times a day. Go to the next slide, please. So to start with, just want to go back to something Harrison said about normalizing Black faces and Black bodies. And basically all that means is, as he said, making it so it's not atypical. It's common to see different people outside and in remote places. But I just want to start with just a quote by Carolyn Finney, who has written a book called Black Faces, White Spaces. And in it, just a couple of points. If we think back to our historical context and this, particularly in the African-American experience, you know, there is a collective memory about what happened during that time. And throughout that history of the slavery era, the Reconstruction, Jim Crow era, what's happened in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. And there's a collective memory that brings any community together, but just particularly for African Americans. And just to extend that a bit, and this is what Finney does, she extends this to the outdoors, and she says that for African Americans, this memory, both collective and individual, provides a way to name and create a space which gives or reaffirms the power to recreate ourselves in the places we live in. And this allows us to construct environmental spaces in our own image. So in other words, you know, how do different ethnic groups kind of adapt and create places and create a space for themselves within the great outdoors? Next slide, please. And so what I want to do is just highlight a couple of ways this is happening right now. And also this highlights some strategies for us as to how we close that gap. And one is Outdoor Afro. Some of you might be familiar with them. It's a national organization. It's a grassroots community-based organization founded by Rue Mapp out of California. She's kind of gotten famous lately. But she has an organization that has over 90 trained leaders in cities throughout the country. They lead weekend outings for African-American families and kids, going to state parks, local parks. They visit local farms. Sometimes it's a longer trip. I know that they sometimes visit national parks. But it's a space in which they teach camping, they teach bicycling, things as simple as that, but to get more people engaged in the outdoors. Next slide, please. There's another group called Girl Trek, and this was founded by 2 women who saw walking as a way to get Black women healthier and get them outside, but in their own neighborhoods, using the sidewalks and streets in their own neighborhoods to walk and promote health. And these walks have gone great distances. For example, they did a walk along the Underground Railroad that went across several states. And they've also been meeting in national parks and doing hiking of that kind. But again, it's one in where they are pretty much doing it on their own terms, going outside, meeting together as women in kind of in a safe space for them. Next slide, please. And this one I just stumbled onto. I should have known about it a long time ago, but I did know about the Joy Project. But this one is, in this book by James Mills, he chronicles a group of Black mountain climbers who they go and take on Denali. And I want to say it's 13 of them, and they do it. And he chronicles this in the book, but in the book, he also recognizes and writes about other outdoor adventurers who happen to be Black, to be kind of an inspiration to others that, you know, the outdoors does not belong to any one group. It belongs to all of us. Next slide, please. And then there are also other groups like Latino Outdoors, where in their vision statement, which I have highlighted, that they're doing a similar kind of thing, not trying, but they are promoting the outdoors and nature to the Latino community across the country. And they are promoting it as safe, inclusive, and a welcoming place, going back to something that Carolyn Finney has written about in some of her work, but trying to create a space where people of color not just feel comfortable, but just recognizing that these places belong to them and their heritage and history is also tied up in these natural and cultural resources. Next slide, please. So with this, we just see challenges to this idea of what some people call white normativity, that just because the parks have been used a certain way or managed in a certain way, that's the way they should be managed and are only for certain types of people. And if we don't camp a certain way, or hike a certain way, then we're not doing it right. Harrison, you want to extend on that? I think he went away. I was going to let you take white normativity, or I could finish it if you want me to. I think it's frozen. I'll take it. So basically, it's this idea that that I was saying that we said earlier, when we talked about Ahmaud Arbery, Dudley Edmondson, and Rahawa Haley, is that we want it to appear that no one's out of place. It doesn't have, these are not white spaces. These are spaces for everyone, and our participation, our style of participation, the way it's done, where we do it, it should not be normalized or measured against a white standard.
So thinking a little bit more about this idea of white normativity, just wanted to give an example here. This is someone that probably everyone on this call is familiar with, I would assume. And we teach about both of these guys in all of our recreation and park programs across the country at all three levels, from undergrad all the way to the PhD program. And so recognizing John Muir and his contribution, and so of course this is one of his comments on Hetch Hetchy Valley, 1,000 flowers leaning confidingly against their adamantine bosses, while birds, bees, and butterflies help the river and waterfalls to stir all the air into music. Everybody needs beauty as well as bread, places to play in and pray in, where nature may heal and cheer and give strength to the body and soul. And I reflect, when I read this, I remember my days as a graduate student, especially as a PhD student, and learning about John Muir really much more intimately, and seeing that this guy wasn't just a conservationist and wasn't just someone that loved outdoors, but really was a poet. And had he not really given life to his words to describe some of these spaces, how many of our parks would have probably never existed? But I want us to think about this. I want us to fast forward to the next slide. Just hit it once, Shauna. And I want us to think about this one, a similar writing from 1921. For sheer physical beauty, for sheen of water and golden air, for nobleness of tree and flower of shrub, for shining river and song of bird and the low, moving whisper of sun, moon, and star. It is this the beautifulest stretch I have seen for 20 years. And so now we have another individual who, in similar fashion, describes the outdoors in a very poetic nature. And really, without ever visiting this spot, you already have an image that comes to mind. Now, is anyone, and you can unmute your mic or you can write in the comments in the chat box, is anyone familiar or want to take a guess at who might be the author of this particular writing? Or maybe the location that they were referring to. Right, so I see MLK. Anyone else? All right. Shauna, would you click once for us? Okay, this is the author. Are any of us familiar with who this gentleman is? You can again put that in the. Thank you. Okay, good. All right, so a couple of us are familiar with Du Bois. And Myron and I are having this conversation, is a Du Bois, a Du Bois. And so for those of us that are unfamiliar, this was one of the leading scholars of the late 1800s, early 1900s. Very fascinating story about earning his PhD from an Ivy League and being one of the first to do so. And he has a number of writings, but he also has a number of studies that he has contributed to that has really done a fascinating job of explaining and describing the life of African Americans in the late 1800s and early 1900s. One of his books that Myron absolutely champions is the Philadelphia Negro, where he went to tens of thousands of African American homes and asked them, through a series of interviews and surveys about the quality of their life and their activities. And so he's one of the first people that we have on record, not just describing the outdoors, but also describing the recreational activities of African Americans. And so over 100 years ago, he's already collecting this data, and he is showing, not just in his description of Idlewild. Is anyone familiar with Idlewild and the significance of Idlewild? We'll look at that in the chat box real quick as I'm talking. Not just describing Idlewild, but also just describing not just his perception or his perspective, but how so many other African Americans across this country at that time were really connected to the outdoors. But those voices were never brought to the table. Those perceptions and those perspectives were never really considered in the establishment and the maintaining of some of our protected areas. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar, yes, thank you, Yolanda. African American actually was a resort that a lot of African Americans would frequent in the spring and summer as a result of them being unable to visit other areas. And so when you think about who were the elite people of that day, not just Du Bois, but even, Duke Ellington and many of those people that contributed to the Harlem Renaissance. Her name escapes me right now, Madam C.J. Walker, the first woman to be a millionaire in this country, not just first African-American, but the first woman, period. And she has over $1 million at her disposal in the early 1900s, and she's not allowed to visit both public and private resorts. And so Idlewild was the space, and it is still actually in existence today. Maybe not some of the beauty that Du Bois describes, but the concept is still there. All right, so let's move forward and continuing. So one of the thoughts, as Myron talks about sort of some of the challenges for our parks and protected areas to consider, I want us to think about how do we close the gap for those African Americans, because we would still argue that today there are still, we gave you some examples. Myron and I, we can call people up and bring them into this call right now, people who love the outdoors and people who engage in these natural landscapes on a regular basis. And I always hesitate to give anecdotal stories because it's not as satisfying sometimes as being able to show surveys. But I have an uncle who loves the outdoors and has skipped many family gatherings because the weather was too nice. And so he was out on the ocean fishing. And I vividly remember coming home from college one year, and we're trying to have Thanksgiving dinner and we can't find him. And finally we just sit down and eat. And later we find out hours later that he spent the entire day alone on the water fishing. And he was just like, you all know I'm not going to pass up this moment, right? So we know that there's this love. We know that there's this, from the data that Myron has shown, that there's this recognition that there are these healing properties that exist in our natural landscapes where our our physical and our emotional and mental health can be improved as a result. But that recognition doesn't necessarily result in behavior or action where we see an increase in numbers. And so the question is for us, what are the things that we can do? What are the considerations that we need to be aware of when we think about African American communities and how to engage them? And so one small glimpse that I want to present to us today is this idea of racial socialization. And what racial socialization ultimately says is that for most families of color, especially African American families, that from birth, we begin to engage in this process of transmitting these messages to our children, in which we help them to understand what life means for them as an African American, what life means for them as a Mexican American or a Cuban American. And not only, sort of what should they be aware of, what should they consider, what should be some of the things that they're going to have to negotiate, but what are appropriate behaviors? What are appropriate recreational activities? And so, we're familiar, I think it was the mid to late 90s, this movie comes out called White Men Can't Jump. This is a prime example of this socialization, that certain races should be engaged in one set of activity and certain races should be engaged in another set of activities. And so parents view it as a vital role that they are being a good parent by transmitting these messages. And so what we would submit to you, what I would, not speaking for Myron, but what I would encourage you all to think about is, what does that socialization process look like in your state? What are the messages that some of our young people and some of our families are receiving that might prevent them from engaging in the outdoors? What are some of the perceptions that they may have that are positive, but then there are other things that are serving as barriers or apprehensions that are preventing them from engaging in these spaces? So let's move to the next slide, please. All right, so I want you all to do this. I want you all to get in that chat box for a moment. And I want you all to think about your agencies. I want you to think about your camping trips, your hiking trips. Think about the visitors that typically frequent your parks. And again, I want you to think about the frequent visitor. Don't automatically start pointing and highlighting that Latino family that comes once, every 3 months. But think about who is regularly in your park and what do they look like? And the question is, what are the considerations that they may take into place before they visit? Are you aware of those? How do people prepare for your parks? What equipment do they bring? How many people come on their own versus bring their families? How many people come in group settings? How long do they stay? Are they there for a few hours? Are they there for a couple of days? Do they visit certain trails that are well known, or do they go off some of the trails and just sort of, freestyle, and they know that, hey, this is my area? And I want you to, just take 2 minutes to add some comments to the chat box. When you have people that visit your parks for the first time, what are some apprehensions that you're prepared to sort of help them work through? Is it bugs? Is it, it's hot out here. Where's the restroom? What are those? Okay, and so I'm going to look at the chat box. And I'm waiting for you all to start adding some comments. All right, C. Tenji, can you provide a little bit more? Is it safe? Are you referring to wildlife? Is it safe? Bears and snakes, as someone else just said? How to hike safely, not disturb wildlife. Okay, good. Proper apparel, gear. What can I do? Okay, very good, very good. All right, now, of course, I know that, okay, and I see that some people don't prepare, they just sort of show up and realize how hot it is, okay? And, um, and I want us to think and take a moment to maybe consider what this same process might look like for an African-American family, all right? So as Myron knows, I have 3 little people that live in my house. Or maybe I should say I live in a house that these 3 little people think they own, right? And so my oldest is 5 years old, and he, Myron, I haven't told you this. He is absolutely geared up that once this pandemic ends, we are going camping, and he has come in, and for weeks now we're coming into our 2nd month of him letting me know that I want to go camping. And while we're camping, I want to go out on the water. I want to get on a boat. And he has planned this entire trip in his mind. Okay. And so I want you all to now think about what might be some considerations that I have to give, in addition to the list that you all have provided. What might that experience look like for me? And you can begin to add those to the chat box. But what I want to do is I want to turn your attention, and we don't have a slide for this, but I want to turn your attention to a number of conversations that have been occurring on social media amongst African Americans who are bird watchers, who are hikers, who are joggers. And some of the comments, and they've been using hashtags like, Black Birders Week, or hiking while Black, or jogging while Black. And if you get on Twitter, you'll see these hashtags. And one of the primary things that we are seeing is that you have a number of people who are Black, who are hikers, that are commenting on the need to take their family with them on a hike so that they are not considered a physical threat while they're at a state park or a county hiking trail, or if they visit, the Allegheny bike trail, for example, which I used to live near when I lived in Pennsylvania. These were considerations, these were concerns. So they had the gear, they were familiar with camping, but they had to think about, what can I take? What camouflage, what accessories do I take with me so that I fit in and I'm not considered a physical threat in this area? And Becky points out interactions with law enforcement, the potential for someone to call the police or make a comment about, hey, I'm not used to seeing people that look like you in this space. Some of us engage in hiking and camping as a solitary activity. We are not interested in engaging anyone. We go out there to be one with nature, right? Yes, the assumption that people can't swim. That's a whole nother conversation, Melody, that I would love to engage in. But as we think about this, and this is one of the things that I want to challenge us to do, is as we talk about closing the gap for African Americans, yes, there are some logistical things that you all can consider, but how do we communicate to African Americans and to their families that this is your space? How do we communicate to them that that this is a space where you will not stand out, that you can engage in the same experience? I think right now I would suggest to us that we're not all engaged in the same experience. We may be engaged in the same space and the same activities, but we have drastically different experiences based on our racial identity and based on our gender. All right, so let's move on. And thank you all. I really want you all to continue to add conversations in the chat box. So now we're going to shift our attention finally to, what are some actions that we can consider? What are some things that we should, some nuggets that you can walk away with? So if we look at the next slide, you'll see, I think, six different ideas. And we're going to highlight these. We're going to take our time and move on to the next slide to highlight these and give some clear examples. All right. So ensuring safe and welcoming parks and policies and procedures. And so I'll start with policies and procedures, and then I'll hand it over to Myron to talk about, ensure safe and welcoming parks. I want us to think about, everything from our paperwork to, what is our policy on licensing, to have a license to hunt or fish, and how do we handle disputes in our parks? And is there a potential that some of our policies, things that are not overtly discriminatory, things that are at no level intended to block people from engaging, but may have unintentional consequences? So if we know that we live in a part, I'm originally from Miami, Florida, so I think about the Everglades, and I haven't been there in probably 20, 30 years now. But if we think about the Everglades as an example, and there's an application that you have to fill out in order to participate in certain activities. What languages are those applications in? And we know that that is a population that has a high immigration community, people from Haiti, people from the Dominican Republic, people from Jamaica, people from Nigeria, and Trinidad and Tobago. And so when we think about that, do we have languages on our websites? Do we have brochures that communicate to people that, hey, this is your space. You now live here, and you are more than welcome to come in. Again, not overtly discriminatory, but something that simple where we don't recognize the multiple languages that exist in our backyard that might prevent people from ever considering the possibility of participating. I think about disputes. I was in a conversation here in the state of South Carolina 2 weeks ago at our state conference, and there was a discussion about an interaction that took place, and there were some heated words that took place between two different groups at one of the parks here in South Carolina, and the response was to call local law enforcement. And the conversation that I had with the director was, what does that interaction communicate to the constituents of that community when there was no crime that was committed? It was a heated exchange, and the automatic response was that we call the police. There are times when law enforcement is necessary, but do we have a relationship and an understanding with our local law enforcement or with our enforcers within some of our state parks, where there's a clear understanding that this is how we approach these situations, so that people recognize that this too is my space. So I know we're getting short on time, so I'm going to hand it over to Myron to talk about ensuring safe and welcoming parks.
Yeah, thank you, Harrison. And just to extend that, the safety issue, I see some of that popping up in the chat, but the question of, have you fully considered how Black or other people of color visitors perceive your parks? And as I mentioned before, some of these points are based on research that we've done. And I just want to highlight a couple of quotes that came from a focus group with a group of African Americans that we were talking to about being a part of a friends group or giving to national parks in their area. But these quotes kind of give it from their perspective. Next slide. So for example, we had one person who said, they think this is an outdoors person, they've gone to the mountains and they've gone to different places. And I should say this was 2018. And you can see that it says, I don't think I would feel safe in those open spaces like that to want to go on a regular basis. Definitely not in this period of time. And in this period of time just means in the last few years, we've seen more, I'll just say negative interactions and encounters in the outdoors, and some potential violence against Black people. Next slide, please. And then there's another one, just referring to kind of just taking a more of a historical view of it, saying that those spaces, and these are just parks in general, haven't been safe for people of color historically, number one. And the day before yesterday, there was an incident in California where this white woman was harassing Black people. This conversation about spaces, who's allowed and who's not allowed. And she was referring to the situation in Oakland in a city park. Next slide, please. And another, I'll just say observation for us is to think about, are Black people being positioned to lead the change that we want to see? And this phrase, recognizing agency, ties back to the groups that I mentioned, like Outdoor Afro, Latino Outdoors, Girl Trek, where they have capacity and they've started these groups and they're bringing people in and they're actually changing the game, if you will, in terms of who's outside, who's outdoors, and who's doing these tremendous things like climbing Denali. I mean, that would be something that someone would say, well, they did that. But there is agency within the community that is a resource for the kinds of things and kind of change that we want to see. So one of the things I wanted to highlight, most of us are engaged in partnerships of some type. And this is just another quote from that same focus group. And there were 21 people in these focus groups across 2 cities, Atlanta and Charlotte and DC. But this is one particularly about partnerships. And it says, now you need us. And this is the Park Service sponsored these focus groups. It says, now you need us. I'm not negating it, but yes, now you need us. Okay. You know what you've got to do. For me, this conversation about being a part of a friends group or giving to the national parks is welcome. But doing what you're doing now, this is outreach, that's all significant. That hasn't been done in years. It's going to take time. So I guess that speaks to the importance of building relationships with groups like the ones I mentioned earlier. You can go to the next slide. And this group, this person spoke directly about Outdoor Afro as a potential group that the Park Service should reach out to. And the reason it's given here, this is one of the participants saying, it's because they, Outdoor Afro, know the language of their people. That just meaning they know what resonates within the African American community. They are community-based, so they know what the community speaks. They've connected it also to health and longevity, that we have to become a healthier people. That's part of their community building strategy as well. So basically trying to connect the interest of the community with the interest of the Parks Service, and also a broader interest in health and nature.
And so going back again to that idea of agency and partnering with these organizations, there's this concept that we embrace when we're talking about working with populations and communities of color, and it's this idea of restorative practices. And what we are suggesting is that oftentimes there's a temptation for us to look at a group, and it's not just based on race. It could be based on gender. It could be based on economic income, where we look at a group and we see them as disadvantaged. And so we sort of have this savior syndrome of, I want to go in and I want to rescue them. We're going to put on this program for this group. And so it becomes sort of, we're going to do this to them, so we're in charge, or we're going to do this for them. So now we're giving you permission to join us, getting back at the white normativity concept. And what we're suggesting is that the healthiest approach is to take this perspective that we're going to pull up alongside you. And we're going to recognize that we bring a certain set of resources to the table, and then you bring a certain set of resources to the table. And so even in our research, I may have access to financial resources that could help launch a program. You may have access to facilities. You may have access to jobs. Someone mentioned the ability to, really improve the marketing and representation in the marketing. And you may have those resources, but then there are other resources that are equally valuable that these communities bring to us. These communities, they understand what it takes sometimes to get the people that look like them to come and visit us in our parks. They are aware of historic stories that we are not yet telling in our parks, and I'm gonna stop there so that I don't get into Myron's territory. But recognizing that these communities do have resources, they do have things that they bring to the table that are just as valuable as what our agencies may have to offer, and we need to view them more as partners as opposed to projects.
Yeah, and I'll just for point of emphasis, I skipped over that initiate sustainable partnerships. And I think what Harrison is suggesting is a way of partnering where it is where it has life, it has longevity, and it's sustainable across groups and across time, and it doesn't fall apart when one person leaves and goes to another park, or one person leaves a community and goes to another community. Next slide, please. So another thing to think about is interpretation and how we are presenting stories in our parks, how we're presenting our resources, either natural or cultural. And just to illustrate this, just want to draw on a paper written by a colleague of ours here at NC State and at Texas A&M, focused on Cedar Hill State Park in Texas. I think Jim on the call might be familiar with this. Next slide, please. And this just comes from someone in the community, and the context is, why aren't African Americans in the community more connected to this particular state park? And I just pulled out this particular quote. It says, if we know if we're in the middle of the story or not. Basically, we know if our story is being told. And it says, we know if we're in the middle of the story or on the fringe. If we can find opportunities to move us to the center, we might increase interest and I might give something to the park. But if I'm still sitting like I'm on the periphery, that's not going to work. It's basically meaning that, if my story is not being told, if I'm not somehow represented, then there's really not much of connection or reason for me to visit that park or to make me feel, almost like going back to the first thing we highlighted about making me feel welcome and included in that park. Another example I'll highlight comes from South Carolina. You can thank you. And this is a county park in Charleston. It's part of the Charleston County Park System, and it's the McLeod Plantation Historic Site. And one of the themes that they've used over time is transition to freedom. And in my mind, and I think Harrison might agree, one of the great things about Charleston County Parks and the decision of how they interpreted this plantation is that they emptied the main house of all the furniture, all of the things that what might adorn a plantation home in Charleston, mid-1800s, and it's an empty home. And all of the focus is on the cabins where the enslaved people live. And the plantation was, at one point, it was a headquarters for Confederate soldiers. At one point, it was headquarters for Union soldiers. It's been an active farm plantation, and it's held people against their will. It's connected families across generations, and all that can be told in a way that involves everyone, in a way that respects and gives dignity to each of those, particularly those people who are enslaved. It just gives them a level of dignity, because those descendants are still in that area. They still live there. In fact, at one point, one was actually an interpreter at this particular site. But again, bringing people in the story centrally, or some way that they feel recognized and a part of that, and just see their stories being told. I think this is the last part. This is examining staff and leadership, and I think I saw a reference to this in the chat box. And just for us to look at our planning, our strategic planning, to see how we're incorporating diverse staff, particularly in this context. Are we developing or grooming leadership for the future? Next slide. One thing to highlight here is that Darcita Taylor from the University of Michigan, kind of a well-known name in our circles, she did a comprehensive study of over 200 conservation organizations a while back, looked at a range of things. And what I'll highlight here is just the makeup of governmental and non-governmental staff hired back around that time, and basically showing that the 493 people hired in those organizations during the time of her study around 2014, I think that's the date of it, only 12.8% were people of color. She also looked at board membership in environmental foundations. 210 people were appointed to boards, but only 28 were from a people of color group. And looking at executive leader positions, those who are presidents, CEOs, or executive directors, 56 appointed and only 7 or 12.5% of that group represented. But again, just different ways to think about how diversity can be brought into an organization or brought into an agency or just brought into a park. But there's also a qualification that goes along with that. Next slide. From that report, there's just a quote there I just wanted to highlight, because one of the board members or volunteer leader had this to say about their experience in a particular organization. And it says, people want me because I have brown skin, but they don't want my voice to be different. They want you to then rubber stamp what they're saying. And I say, I thought you wanted me because you really were looking for a different perspective. So with that, the main point, and Harrison might agree, or you might have something to add, but it's like, inviting, I think you've probably heard this, inviting someone to dinner, but you don't let them choose the menu, you don't let them choose a seat at the table, you just invite them in. But this just speaks to a greater and deeper level of engagement, either in board membership, in a work situation, or some type of advisory role. It has to be deep, it has to be deep engagement in whatever process we are developing. So just kind of the wrap up, so on the back end of this, we just tried to make some key points, again, based on the context we presented earlier at the beginning, some of the reflections that we made about current situations, and then trying to dig in a little bit with some of the research that we are engaged in and some of the research that we are citing to kind of come up with these general points. Again, not recommendations that they're definitive, but I think they offer some points for discussion today and in the future, about how do you make a park welcoming and safe? How do you work with different community groups, particularly those that you may not have a strong relationship with? How do you build those relationships? Now, how do you audit policies? Do we have a system for doing that? To make sure that we have a procedure for how to handle disputes, so that it may not escalate and lead down a road that we just don't want to go down. And then, how do we do a better job of telling stories that represent the histories and the legacies of different people in our communities, both locally, state level, and nationally. And then, how do we become strategic for the long run? Just thinking beyond tomorrow. 2050 is out there, and we have to think about how we're going to manage our cultural resources, our natural resources, our wildlife. And as many of you know who manage budgets like I do, they seem to get skinnier every year. And so how do we build support? It's not just tax dollars, as you know, it's donations, it's getting people to participate and give. So we have to be strategic about all of these things. You go to the next slide. So that, I know that was quite a bit to take in, but we really wanted to cover a lot of ground, but at the same time, open up conversation, dialogue, as we called it. And if I was telling, I can say this, Phil, I think that if whatever your feedback is, there are things that you might want to go deeper on. It may be me or maybe Harrison, maybe another person who can do a better job of whatever. But if there's something that you want to go deeper on, we'll help facilitate that in whatever way you'd like.
I think that'll be great. One of the things that we would like to do, we're going to take a couple of questions and some conversation. And I know it's been a lot that's been thrown at us here in the last hour or so, but it's really good stuff. So a couple of things is this presentation is being recorded and it'll be posted on the NASPD website probably sometime next week. So there's a lot of really good information that I saw some folks trying to write down some stuff. So it will be posted and shared on the NASPD website probably sometime next week. And one of the things that we talked about is we would love to hear from our participants today. And you can email me directly or email Lewis directly. And we do think that today it was better than I ever dreamed of, because I saw folks writing stuff down and being involved in the chat. So I think there's an opportunity for us to delve a little bit deeper, and certainly would love to have Dean Floyd and Dr. Pinckney involved in that process. So a couple of questions coming in now, and I'll try to read them on chat, and Harrison and Myron, y'all can read and jump in there as well. How do socioeconomic issues contribute to the lack of diversity in parks is one of the questions.
I'll take that one if you don't mind. I can start. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, so it plays a large role, and it's consistent across time. And it just is common sense too, and that lower income groups will not make that long trip from South Carolina to Rocky Mountain National Park, or they may not go to Maine Baxter State Park. That's just a long drive. So that's socioeconomic status does play a role, but in our research, we also find that even when we look at people who have income available to go to parks, they may go or they may not. But the other thing to think about too is that there is a very large Black middle class. I forget what the number is on it these days, but people are making decisions about where they go. They have dollars to spend. And the one thing I'll say is that if we want those dollars, we need to compete for them. Just like Subaru and just like any other retailer, REI and Dick's Sporting Goods, whatever the company is, they're doing it.
Yeah, and Myron, one thing I would add is that I would also challenge us to think about, sort of it's almost a very broad brushstroke to, when we talk about the economic status, socioeconomic status, because I think about like right here in South Carolina, Sesquicentennial Park, it's right in Columbia, right? That's not a park that necessarily requires a lot of financial capital. So I think that there are some situations in which, yeah, the economics come into play. But I remember a paper that Myron made us read when we were students. I was a student of his, but it was dealing with how there's so many other factors beyond just the socioeconomic status, like that can explain some level of behavior. But there are so many other factors for us to consider, and there are so many spaces in which socioeconomic status may not necessarily really be a barrier, because the park is down the street or it's within reasonable driving distance where people have access. And so the question is, how do we dig past that to think about what some of those other challenges might be? One
of the comments with the challenges was for public transportation and as part of that, socioeconomics and public transportation and location of parks and that as well was one of the questions that came in. Then there's some really questions that we can delve a little bit deeper, and I think we're a little bit prohibitive on time with some folks having to drop off, but some questions about, what can we do to better recruit and diversify staffing? That is a question in my career that we talk about every year, and how do you do that? And, obviously a numbers say that we don't do a very good job at that. And, just if y'all would kind of comment on that just briefly, and then I'll wrap it up and offer some closing comments.
You want me to go first, Myron?
You can go first.
All right. I have two thoughts that immediately come to mind. I think about our colleague Lavelle Merritt, who works with the National Park Service, and I know he's got a couple of initiatives that have been proven very effective. And so I think that there are some models out there for increasing these numbers. But one of the things, again, thinking about resources, a state like North Carolina, where Myron is located, especially rich with historically Black colleges and universities. and thinking about the number of those institutions that have forestry programs, biology programs, botany programs, programs that could feed directly into some of the skill sets and knowledge that you all engage in every single day. But then the question is, how often do we frequent those institutions? And I don't think it's just with some of our parks. I would even argue with us as a major, and trying to get graduate students that look like myself and Myron. You know, we don't always take advantage of North Carolina Central, Grambling, North Carolina A&T, South Carolina State, Florida A&M, and these schools that are largely producing massive quantities of students that are scientific students, students that are into agriculture, students that are into the outdoors, but we're not tapping in yet for a range of reasons.
I was going to type in my last answer, but I also think it'll be quick. We need to also connect to parents, especially those who are sending kids to school, because parents always want to know what are you going to major in, how much does it pay, you know, what are the career prospects for it, and sometimes, and we see this a lot in the College of Natural Resources here at NC State with forestry and parks and recreation. Sometimes the starting salaries are not always great, but if you can get in and stick with it, the career is awesome. And so it's a matter of selling that to parents, and how do you get in and stay in it for the long haul.
Great points. Dean Floyd, Dr. Pinckney, Myron, and Harrison, thank y'all so much. This has been really, really good. Before everybody closes out, I've got a couple of things to do, and we'll talk about our next webinar. But last, I'd like to say this of what we did today is, you know, we're in October almost of 2020, and usually this time of year, everybody says, wow, this year has really flown by. I'm not sure anybody's going to say this October that this year has really flown by, because I think it was like 427 days ago that it was March. This has been a long year. But so I'll leave with this thought, and then I'll ask Lewis to wrap it up for us. If we go back to the way things were, we have lost the lesson. And what a mistake that would be. You know, 2020 has been all these things that have gone on. And one of the things besides the pandemic was this awareness of social justice and race relations. And you know, everybody keeps saying, I'll be glad when we get back to normal. And my thoughts are, we don't want to go back to the way things were. If we do, we'll have lost the lesson of 2020. And what a mistake that would be. The goal today was simple. The goal today was we wanted to give you something to think about. Maybe awareness leads to a conversation, and a conversation leads to understanding, and that understanding leads to change and to growth. And I think what we've done today is that we've kind of connected and had a conversation. And we're aware of some things that maybe we wasn't aware of before, and the conversation has started. I think it's worth continuing this conversation. And what I'd like to do is we'd like to hear from you, and ask us what you would like to ask, and tell us what you want to know more about. And I think what we'll do is we'll put together an additional webinar in the near future to kind of follow up on this conversation, because shame on us if we just do this one time and say that we did one. So I think the time is now to continue the conversation that leads to understanding, and that leads to change and to growth. Again, thank you, Dr. Floyd, Dr. Pinckney. Awesome presentation, has really opened up our eyes and given us a lot to think about. Our next webinar will be in November 12th, where we'll talk about the Great American Outdoors Act and the Land Water Conservation Fund and how that'll work. And so I'll conclude today to thank everyone on behalf of Clemson University. We appreciate the National Association of State Park Directors and our partnership as we move forward. And Lewis Ledford, I'll turn it over to you, my friend, and let you close us out. Remember, you're on mute.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you for those closing thoughts. I was thinking about some thoughts to close. You really hit several of them. And of course, thank you, Dean Floyd and Dr. Pinckney. Very insightful, and we appreciate your time for the presentations. As I thought about the state park systems as you were presenting, I thought about some of the management strategies and the resourcefulness and the innovations that's been a part of America's state parks. But I hope this continues to make us move forward in the growth that Phil's talking about. Special thank you to the 200 plus of you that spoke or that participated today. 38 states, if I counted right. And a special shout out to Texas, Colorado, Delaware, and North Carolina for your very strong participation. Of course, I want to say thanks again to my friend Phil and Clemson and what you're doing to facilitate this quality instruction. And as we do conclude, and Phil's referenced, on November the 12th, 2 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll host our next NASPD Clemson webinar. And I hope all of you are aware of the landmark legislation that was passed this year on the heels of LWCF being authorized in perpetuity last year. It was fully funded with $900 million annually, 450 of that designated for the state side. And at our next webinar, Linda Landerman and I and others who testified in Congress will be sharing information about what that means to the stateside program and how we truly manage that in the way that's going to be so meaningful in continuing this great program that's been described by some around the country as some of the most successful language and legislation that's ever been drafted in Congress. Again, thank you to the presenters, and Phil, thanks again for a great presentation. We look forward to having this on stateparks.org website in the near future.